reproductive isolation is probably the most important way we can determine whether individuals are members of the same species or not. So if individuals are reproductively isolated, then we can determine that they are separate species. So reproductive isolation, it refers to species' ability to reproduce and importantly create fertile offspring. So we'll talk a bit more about that shortly. So if we've got two individuals from two different species, they should not be able to reproduce and create fertile offspring. So we say that that means they're reproductively isolated, and that's an indication that they are separate species. So we've got two different types of reproductive isolation. We have pre-zygotic and we have post-zygotic. I'll talk about both of those in some detail. So firstly, we need to talk about what is a zygote. In order to talk about pre and post-zygotic, we need to have a head around what a zygote is. So very simply, when a sperm cell from a male is fused with an egg cell from a female, what we end up with is a zygote. So a zygote is just the fusing of a sperm and an egg cell. So when we talk about reproductive isolation, so reasons why two different species can't mate with one another and create fertile offspring, we can either have a problem with a zygote forming in the first place, or we can actually get a zygote and an individual born through the mating of two different species, but they end up being infertile. So we still say that they are reproductively isolated because their progeny cannot mate with other progeny in order to create their own children. So let's have a look first at post-zygotic. So an example of post-zygotic reproductive isolation. So we've got here a horse and a donkey. So this is an example of where we have two individuals that can actually successfully mate and have a child together, and we end up with a mule. So if a horse and a donkey are to mate, we end up with a mule at the end. But the problem is, even though they are able to form a zygote, so a sperm and an egg cell are able to fuse, create a zygote, which eventually is able to grow into a fully grown mule, what will happen is this mule is infertile. So we don't have mules being able to breed with other mules. We end up with a horse and a donkey creating a mule, but it's infertile. It cannot breed. So there's all sorts of examples of after zygote forming, we might have the young die really early on. There might be problems with the immune system, but generally, even if two different species are able to mate, form a zygote, and then an individual or a child, that child won't live to reproductive age or be able to reproduce. So we say that they're still reproductively isolated. That is a form of post-zygotic reproductive isolation. If we go on now to pre-zygotic reproductive isolation, there's several reasons, several different ways in which, or mechanisms to having pre-zygotic reproductive isolation occur. So a sperm and an egg cell between two different species will not be able to form a zygote and fuse together. So we say they're reproductively isolated pre-zygote. So the first of which we're going to look at is ecological isolation. So ecological isolation can come about because we might have two species do not share a habitat, or even just a breeding ground. So if they travel to locations to breed, these might be different locations. So in ecological reproductive isolation, the reason why two different species can't form a zygote or can't mate with one another is because they don't live in the same area. So this could be because there's something blocking their ability to travel between one another, or it might just be a matter of distance perhaps. Another form of prezygotic reproductive isolation is temporal isolation. This can refer to different mating periods. So we could talk about an example of something like frogs, for example. We might have two different species of frogs that live in the same area. One might mate in summer, one might mate in winter. That is enough to keep them reproductively isolated, so they won't be able to form zygotes and then progeny. We've also got mechanical isolation. And this is due to, very simply, non-compatible reproductive organs. So two species might be in the right place at the right time, mating at the right time, but their reproductive organs are not compatible, so they can't actually go about forming a zygote because they're unable to mate as a result of that incompatibility of their reproductive organs. Another one which has a few kind of different applications is behavioral isolation. So when we're talking about behavioral isolation, we're talking about particular behaviors which are used to kind of try and impress or woo other individuals of the same species in order for them to mate. So differing species might not understand or react to these courtship displays or pheromones we can also have in the intended manner. So if we look at courtship displays, these can be things like bright colours, feathers, dances. There's particular birds that decorate their nests and things like that to try and impress individuals of the same species to mate with. If they are to do these and they will not impress other species, so the other species will not mate with them, this is a way in which they maintain reproductive isolation. And the other one is pheromones. Pheromones. So certain species might give off particular pheromones which are intended to attract the opposite sex. Once again, different species aren't going to have that attraction to those particular pheromones, even though they can be quite similar. So a lot of these types of isolation, even though two species might look and act quite similarly, there's just this little key factor which avoids them being able to reproduce, and that's enough to deem them as being separate species. The final one is gametic or gamete isolation. And here we're very simply talking about incompatible gametes. So even if two species are able to mate with one another, perform sexual intercourse, sometimes the gametes just won't be compatible. So we won't get the formation of a zygote because the sperm and egg cell are just unable to fuse with one another. So I guess to summarize, reproductive isolation is the main mechanism which keeps species, or we're able to use to determine whether we've got different species. And this can be post-zygotic. So if two different species can form a zygote through the fusing of a sperm and an egg, they may be able to produce progeny, but it will be infertile or not be able to survive to reproductive age. Or we can have pre-zygotic, so before a zygote is formed, reproductive isolation through ecological, temporal, mechanical, behavioural, or gametic isolation.